afternoon. How are you all doing?
Good.
Awesome. I want to just say that I'm humbled to be able to be asked to be able to speak today, and thank Tom for the opportunity to speak today as we talk about reimagining missions, reimagining local missions. So I want to start my talk off with a story, right? So I grew up in the inner city of Los Angeles, and so I grew up at the time in the 80s and 90s at the height of where a lot of drugs were being sold. The urban culture. It's funny when you grow up in a city like Los Angeles in the 80s and 90s, you don't realize how the communities that I was in, that I lived in, were shaping the world. Where people in China and everywhere are listening to hip hop music and wearing the clothes and all those things. And so I lived in that time, and a lot of my time when I lived there, a lot of my friends at the time were hustling. Like they were selling illegal drugs and doing things illegal to make money. Right? And so at the time, I didn't realize it. I just thought, man, I knew it wasn't good. I knew that this is the way that God did not intend for people to do business in this way, but I didn't really understand, how to make a difference or what to do to be able to impact my community. But I always remember my friends saying, if you're scared, go to church. And what that meant was, the church does not have anything tangible to offer me. All they're offering me is spiritual goods and services. And so as I became of age, I recognized we need to do something about this. We need to, as American Christians, we need to reimagine missions in urban inner city communities. But first, we need to understand the difference between mission and missions, right? We need to define that word mission. Because usually when we think about mission, right, we think about mission as that's the general call of the church. We're all called to mission. When we hear the word missions, as we're defining it here, as I'm defining it, missions with an S is really about reaching the unreached. Now, there's two myths of mission. Many of us think that when we engage in missions, right, we need to go overseas. And because we're going overseas to do missions, we believe, I'm reaching the unreached. But many times when we do missions with an S overseas, we are doing interchurch aid and working with Christians that are already there. Many times we're not reaching the unreached. And so what if God did not call us to go overseas, right? Because all of us don't have the call to necessarily go overseas to do missions. What if he called us to stay domestic here in America? Well, if he caused us to stay here in our country, America, and do missions with an S, I think a general call of that is to serve the poor. Would you agree? Say yes. And so we see in Luke 4:18 through 19, that Jesus really established his ministry. And he says, listen, I came for the poor, widow, the orphan, the blind, the oppressed, the captive. Right? And so we see this as a part of Jesus' ministry, and we also see it in the Old Testament. Like, we can't get away from serving the poor. In the Old Testament, God was very clear with the Israelites. He says, listen, I want you to serve the poor, widow, orphan. Clear with the Israelites. And many times they went into exile because they failed to do that. They started to think about themselves. And then we see this clear call in the New Testament, serve the poor. But how do we serve the poor? How do we love the poor? Well, we believe that there's three ways to serve the poor, and we talked about it a lot today. Well, the first way is relief, giving away things, right? Like we could give away food, clothing, meeting immediate needs. That's relief. And we all get that. We all understand that. But the next way to serve the poor is development. Like with serving the poor, how do we develop people to become economically self-sufficient? As believers, we need to ask that question. But the third way that we can serve the poor is social reform. And when I say social reform, I'm talking about changing laws, changing systems that may keep the poor down. If you study other countries and how they build wealth, the two things that countries need to build wealth is the rule of law and the ownership of property. Rule of law and the ownership of property. And that's what countries need to build wealth. But that's the same here in America. And so if we think about reimagining missions, we need to address poverty in U.S. urban inner cities from an individual and systemic perspective. So when I talk about an individual perspective, many of us think that as we think about individual perspective, we think about poverty related to debt. Because honestly, right, if we get in a lot of debt, if we don't understand how to manage finances, poverty will find us. But we also have a systemic poverty or a structural poverty, where laws, ordinances, systems that have kept people in poverty. And we have to look at both as Christians who are engaging the poor and doing missions. So I have a question for you. I want to take 10 seconds for you to think about this, and I'm going to give you 10 seconds. When you think about your city in North America, wherever you live, have you ever asked yourself the question, how did urban inner city communities get this way? I ask you the question again. When you think about your city in North America, wherever you live, have you ever asked yourself the question, how did urban inner city communities get this way? Well, I have a small history lesson for you. From 1934 to 1962, the FHA started to give away loans. There was over $120 billion worth of new housing and real estate that was given away to Americans. 120 billion, everybody say 120 billion dollars. You guys didn't say it like you mean it, it's okay. But of that $120 billion of real estate that was given away, 98% of that real estate went to Caucasian or Anglo families. And only 2% of that real estate went to minority or non-white families because of the discrimination that was happening at the time. But also we see redlining. Now, when many non-white communities and residents of our country were able to now get loans, a lot of times they weren't given loans if they didn't live on the right side of the tracks. And so we see the redlining happening in the community. But also, if you think about our history, and this happened in the 1950s and 60s at the time, but in the 1960s, in inner city communities, there was a lot of manufacturing jobs. But in the late 1960s, we see a lot of those jobs being cut and billions of dollars being lost because of the manufacturing industry. Many incomes declining. But in the 1970s and 80s, we're talking about how do we get to these urban inner city communities? How were they created? Yes, they were created individually, but we also see in the 1970s, we see the exodus of the African-American middle class, where many men and women that now can get loans to buy homes in the suburbs, because a lot of those laws and ordinances were taken away, now they can buy homes. And so between the FHA loans, redlining, loss of manufacturing jobs, the African-American middle class leaving the city, we are left with this underclass, this urban inner cities, what we see in our communities all across America. And we see this culture of drugs and violence, where the new economy is now drug dealing. And as a result of that, we see prisons being overpopulated with men and women going to prison because of illegal drug sales. And so we see this people hustling. And so we have this culture in urban communities where there's a lot of liquor stores and churches on the same corner. And so as we transition, we see this, that both the individual and systemic factors have contributed to poverty in urban inner city communities. So I have a question for you. How do we reimagine missions in urban communities? How do we reimagine missions in urban communities? Well, I'm glad you asked. Spiritual and economic empowerment. We have to do both. When we talk about reimagining missions in urban communities, that's what Hustle Phoenix does. And that's what the company I lead. I lead a company called Hustle Phoenix, and we address poverty from an individual and systemic perspective. We focus on social and economic empowerment. See, we address poverty individually because we help men and women not only start businesses that help themselves, but also help their immediate family, but also the broader community. Because when we provide jobs for people, we are being a blessing to our community by providing jobs and economic opportunity for people to work. But also we address poverty systematically. And the way we do that is in 3 ways. We address poverty systematically because we offer entrepreneurs the intellectual capital to start businesses. So we support them and help them learn how to start a business. Everything from how do you give a pitch, like how do you pitch your idea to investors, to how do you understand your numbers in a financial statement, to how do you understand a marketing plan and a sales plan. We have all these things for the entrepreneur to really learn, and we're addressing poverty from a systematic approach by helping people and educating people and helping them learn how to start a business. But we also help people socially. And so one of the things we always say, and I always say, is that the difference between wealth and poverty is relationships. I'll say it again. The difference between wealth and poverty is relationships. I'll say it one more time. The difference between wealth and poverty is relationships. And so that's what we do with Hustle Phoenix. We give people bankers, people in sales, marketing, operations, a CPA, a lawyer to really sit around and provide that community. God calls us into community with folks. It's hard to do a business by yourself, and we provide community for the entrepreneurs so they can grow and build and develop. But the last one, the way we address systematic poverty is through financial capital. Not only do we teach them, and provide people and mentors for them, but we also provide actual capital. We have a fund at Hustle Phoenix where we're able to loan money to entrepreneurs, not based on their credit or assets, but based on their character. And we see this as a work of God. We see this as a mission to the community because we see people all over inner city communities, especially in Phoenix, struggling in poverty, selling drugs to make a living, and the prison population is growing as a result of that. To date, Hustle Phoenix has supported over 300 businesses. 50 of those businesses are launching and growing and hiring employees in the city of Phoenix. We are seeking the shalom and the flourishing of the city. But another way we are seeking the shalom and flourishing of the city is through the faith and work. We are helping people really understand how their faith connects to their work and how everything they do, whether they're a parent, they're in school, and they're running a business, how God is impacting all of that. And he should, because God first loved us. And so as I look to conclude, I want to tell a story about Veronica. Veronica runs a business called AZ Cleaning with a Purpose. She's a Latina lady. And she runs a business where she hires women that have been battered and are in abusive relationships. And they run a cleaning company, and they clean homes all throughout Phoenix. But she gives these women that are in abusive relationships an opportunity and a chance to be more of who God called them to be. And she's building her business, she's growing her business, she's hiring more employees, and she's doing an amazing job as she looks to grow and be more of who God called her to be. And so as I look to end, I want to end with an acronym called HUSTLE. Because when we are reimagining missions, when we reach the unreached, we all have to hustle in missions. See, God called all of us to be in missions. I don't care where you are, overseas or locally. God has called us to be in missions, to reach the unreached. And so as we hustle, the H in hustle stands for hard work. When we're in missions, reaching the unreached takes hard work. The U in hustle stands for unstoppable. We must disciple and reach people with reckless abandon. The S in hustle stands for service. We serve people, and we serve because Christ first served us. The T in hustle stands for team. Together, everyone achieves more. When we do missions with an S and reach unreached people, we need local churches, we need missionary organizations, we need universities, we need businesses. We can't do it alone. We need to come together to be of service. The L in hustle means learner. We have to study scripture, books, listen to the culture. And the E in hustle means entrepreneurial. Missions requires innovation and fearlessness. And so if we're going to reach unreached people groups, especially in our urban inner city communities, we have to hustle. Everybody say hustle. 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 Thank you all. My name is Waddell. I represent Hustle Phoenix, and thank you all for listening to this talk.